December 19th, 2025 marked the date. 4 a.m. struck in Brussels. The European Council headquarters held air that was stale, recycled, and thick with tension inside. The most powerful leaders in Europe had spent 19 hours locked in a room. A single trillion-dollar question occupied their argument, one the world waited to hear answered. $105 billion of frozen Russian assets would have their profits seized by the European Union. That money, Moscow's money, would fund Ukraine's defense. Justice in its ultimate form, they called it. The aggressor would pay for the war. But the exhausted leaders stepped out into the camera's glare when the doors finally opened. The narrative had shifted. Off went the seizure. Dead was the reparations loan. The EU would borrow the money itself instead, they announced. European taxpayers would bear another $90 billion pile of debt. Why did they retreat? What made them abandon a free $105 billion pot and burden their own citizens instead? Technicalities explained it. The media told you. Unity was the reason, they said. Lies came from their mouths. Far darker and far more dangerous is the truth. A Moscow court received a lawsuit demanding 18 trillion rubles. That's where the truth lies. A company called Euroclear holds terrifying vulnerability. Most people have never heard of it. The European Central Bank sent a secret warning seizing these assets could destroy the euro itself. Sovereign immunity's geopolitical brinkmanship gets deconstructed today. The summit where Europe realized Russia still held a nuclear option in financial warfare will take you inside. The heist that didn't happen, this is its story. Why the plan failed requires understanding the money first. Roughly $260 billion of Russian central bank assets have been immobilized by G7 nations since February 2022. The catch reveals itself here. Washington vaults don't hold the money. London banks don't store it either. One specific place holds the vast majority, about $191 billion sits there. Belgium. Euroclear's accounts hold it specifically. Euroclear. What is it? The global financial systems plumber, that's Euroclear. A central securities depository functions there, German bonds or French stocks you purchase. Euroclear moves the ownership from seller to buyer. Over $37 trillion in assets get held for clients across 90 countries. European capital markets beat through this heart. The total value of assets held in Euroclear is approximately $37 trillion, covering nearly the entirety of Europe's capital markets. Any disruption to Euroclear's operations would not only affect the clearinghouse itself, but could trigger a domino effect across the entire European banking and investment network. In the final quarter of 2025, the frozen Russian assets at Euroclear generated billions in interest income, a figure that could have been leveraged as a potential source of EU budget funding or even to support financial aid to Ukraine. However, seizing even a single portion of these assets carries complex risks. The funds held in Type C accounts of Western banks in Russia remain exposed, and any retaliatory action could directly impact these holdings. Euroclear's operational integrity is critical. A forced seizure without proper safeguards could cause liquidity shortages, trigger defaults, or even halt the settlement of securities across Europe. Risk assessments highlighted that using the $105 billion frozen assets as a direct source of funding would produce only short-term gains, while long-term consequences could include structural damage to the European banking system, a sharp loss of investor confidence, and a potential downgrade in the euro's reserve currency status. Stress tests conducted by the European Central Bank demonstrated that attempting to repurpose the frozen assets could lead to cascading market failures. Even a minor disruption might trigger a chain reaction of forced liquidations, liquidity squeezes, and credit freezes across multiple EU member states. The ECB concluded that the alternative solution, a $90 billion joint borrowing package backed by the EU budget, presented a far lower systemic risk. In this scenario, European taxpayers would bear the cost, but the broader banking infrastructure and the euro's stability would remain protected. Financial analysts also noted that international investors, from sovereign wealth funds to global pension funds, closely monitor Europe's treatment of frozen assets. Any action perceived as arbitrary or politically motivated could lead to capital flight, reduced investment, and long-term damage to the EU's credibility in global markets. The delicate balance between leveraging assets and maintaining confidence in Europe's financial system was therefore the decisive factor in the leaders' final decision. The combination of operational, legal, and macroeconomic risks ultimately made direct seizure impractical, leaving the EU with borrowing as the safest and most politically viable solution. Unique characteristics mark the Russian assets held there. Matured bonds comprise them. Cash gets paid out when bonds mature. Moscow cannot receive that cash back. Because sanctions prevent it, the cash accumulates. Euroclear's accounts hold it. While earning interest, late 2025 saw this trapped cash generate billions in interest. Ursula von der Leyen led the European Commission toward a bright idea. This cash should be taken. A windfall existed. Extraordinary nature defined it. Russia didn't own it the same way principal belonged to them. A massive $105 billion loan for Ukraine would be backed by leveraging this cash. They drafted this plan. Free money appeared within reach. One thing got forgotten. Risk-free assets don't exist in finance. That's the reality. The third rail of global finance would be touched by reaching for that money. Brussels drafted legislation while Moscow drafted lawsuits. Europe's weak point was known exactly by the Kremlin. Politicians weren't it. The plumbing was. December 12, 2025 arrived. Just 1 week before the summit, a Moscow arbitration court received a lawsuit from the Russian central bank. Euroclear stood as defendant. 18 trillion rubles formed the claim. Approximately $229 billion translates to that. Simple logic drove the lawsuit. Russia's argument went, "Our money is being held by you. Giving it back gets refused by you. Default is your status." Therefore, the full asset value plus punitive damages we're suing for both. So what, you might ask? Belgian jurisdiction doesn't recognize Russian court rulings. Truth marks that statement. But Belgium alone doesn't contain Euroclear. Clients all over the world work with Euroclear. Crucially, Russia's interior holds Euroclear assets. Western banks, investment funds, and pension funds still have billions stuck in Russia. Type C accounts hold them. The Kremlin's message came brutal and clear. Brussels sees you seize our $105 billion. Euroclear gets bankrupted by us seizing $229 billion of Western assets in Moscow. Your own bank's money will pay for what you stole. We'll take it. Symmetrical retaliation. That's the name for this. But Belgium faced an existential threat. A Russian court declaring Euroclear insolvent could trigger defaults cascading through the entire Eurozone. That was the chain reaction. Bart de Wever entered. Belgium's Prime Minister. Months of silence had marked his approach. The December summit's approach made him realize his country was being asked to place its head in the guillotine. Russian assets would be used by the European Commission. That was their want. But Belgium held those assets. Russia would sue Belgium if lawsuits came. Euroclear's assets would face Russian seizure. If assets got seized, 100% of legal and financial risk would be borne by Belgium. The other 26 nations would just receive political credit. Meanwhile, the closed-door meetings saw de Wever draw a line in the sand. Other leaders heard him say, "A parachute must be given to me, and we'll all jump together." An ironclad indemnity mechanism received his demand. Other EU nations would sign a contract. If Euroclear faced lawsuits or bankruptcy from Russia, the bill would be paid by other countries. He wanted this. Germany, France, and Italy would share the liability. He wanted that. Silence filled the room at that moment. Actually signing a check to cover the risk arrived. The other leaders hesitated. Then Russian money spending brought happiness to them. Belgian risk insuring brought no happiness. Politicians argued while technocrats intervened. Christine Lagarde led the European Central Bank in sending a confidential note to negotiating teams. Explosive content filled that note. A liquidity backstop for the plan would not be provided by the ECB. They refused. Foundational reasoning drove the ECB's argument. The world's second most used reserve currency is the euro. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and Indonesia hold euros because property rights are believed sacred in Europe. Sovereign assets would be seized if the EU acted even under windfall tax guise. A signal would be sent to the global south. Your money stays safe until your politics displease us. Capital flight could be triggered by this Lagarde. Warned euros might start getting dumped by central banks worldwide. Gold or yuan would be bought instead. European government borrowing costs would spike if that happened. Inflation would return, the euro would crash. Ukraine funding represents a political goal. Euro preservation represents a survival goal. Survival gets chosen by us. The ECB effectively said this. The safety net got removed by this refusal. Euroclear couldn't be bailed out by the ECB printing money if things went wrong. Without that, the risk stood too high. Rome delivered the final nail in the coffin. Giorgia Meloni. Italy's Prime Minister had initially supported Ukraine. Russian threats became specific. The calculus changed. Italian banks, specifically UniCredit, still had significant Russian exposure. Billions of euros in stranded capital sat in Moscow for UniCredit. Euroclear wouldn't be Russia's only target if retaliation came. European banks operating in Russia would have their assets seized to satisfy the judgment. Italian and Austrian banks like Raiffeisen stood on the front line. Italian bank shareholders would essentially pay for the reparations loan. Meloni realized this. Belgium received her alliance. National interest comes before collective signaling. This was the Meloni doctrine in action. Proceeding without solid legal basis was reckless. She argued this. The consensus died by her hand. A ghost hovered over the entire summit. Donald Trump's incoming administration in the United States represented that ghost. Late 2025 saw backchannels between Trump's transition team and European capitals buzzing. The American message differed from the Biden era. Asset seizure had been pushed by the Biden administration. Caution got urged by the Trump team. Why? A piggy bank wasn't how they viewed the frozen assets. A negotiating chip was. The war would need leverage over Putin to end. Trump's advisors believed this. Assets gone and spent on weapons meant no incentive existed for Russia coming to the table, but merely frozen assets could be offered back to Russia in exchange for ceasefire or territorial concessions. The leverage would be burned by seizing the money. Being out of step with the new US president terrified European leaders. Waiting seemed safer. The man who controlled NATO's future shouldn't be angered. They didn't want that. The 1989 treaty nobody remembered. One more obstacle lay buried deep in international law archives. 1989 saw the Kingdom of Belgium and Soviet Union sign a bilateral investment treaty. Russia inherited this treaty as USSR's successor state. Investments made by one nation in the other's territory received explicit protection from the treaty. Expropriation without compensation got strictly prohibited. Covington and Burling lawyers drafted a white paper circulating among EU leaders. Stark conclusions emerged. Asset use would be allowed by Belgium. Russia could sue Belgium in neutral international arbitration courts, Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, and Russia would win. Belgium would face forced damage payments to Russia, enforceable against Belgian state assets anywhere globally, Belgian ships, Belgian planes. Belgian diplomatic accounts could face global seizure, a legal landmine that nobody noticed until too late. The treaty was this. 4 a.m. arrived. Reality became undeniable. Legal risks existed. The 1989 treaty. Financial risks loomed. Euroclear's bankruptcy. Monetary risks threatened. The ECB's warning. Geopolitical risks pressed. Trump's pressure. Too much weight existed. The reparations loan became impossible. Option B received the leader's pivot. A $90 billion joint borrowing package got announced. Russia's money wouldn't be taken. Bonds would be issued by the European Union instead. Markets would provide the borrowed money. EU budget backing would support it. European taxpayers would pay the interest. This meant that European taxpayers would bear default risk. This meant that a massive fiscal commitment existed, but safety accompanied it. Property rights received respect, Euroclear got protection, euro stability remained, hawks received a bone to save face. Russian assets would be frozen indefinitely. This got agreed. Previously, 6-month renewals were needed for sanctions. Frozen status would stay until Russia paid reparations now. The can got kicked down the road, assets stayed as hostages, but shooting the hostage got refused. Next morning arrived, headlines screamed unity and Ukraine support. But the Kremlin likely released a sigh of relief. The West had been successfully deterred by Russia, symmetrical retaliation threats had worked. Global financial plumbing integration remained too deep for cutting without hurting Europe. They'd proven this. A stay of execution came for Euroclear. Easier breathing came to the Belgian government. But the European taxpayer received the bill's arrival. $90 billion debt would require repayment. Russia paying for it. That illusion shattered against financial reality's hard rocks. The YouTube comments expose what Europe's leadership tried hiding. Trust damage was already done. One commenter noted, "The trust damage is done already, up to 60%, for EU to contemplate the seizure and use of sovereign central bank assets of another country, another cut deeper." The truth lies in the simple fact that stealing the money entrusted to you is not good for business if you are an international banker. It's that simple. The West's integrity credibility took a hit. Since London stole Venezuela's gold, no one believes in the integrity of the West. This comment captured the broader concern. Euroclear's private nature matters. Euroclear is a private company, not an EU institution. The EU is ordering the Belgian government to empty a bank account in a clearing bank owned by, among others, the New Zealand Superannuation Fund. China's Wang Minxing, institutional complexity got exposed. The Saudi factor loomed large. The Saudis will remove all their money from Europe if Russia's assets are seized. Capital flight fears were real. Some saw the bigger picture. What was an existential crisis for Russia very rapidly has become one for the EU and, by extension, NATO. What it is to be governed by children, European dysfunction became the narrative. EU needs brains, not politicians. The EU needs disbanded. They are destroying Europe and the European people. Horrid, authoritarian and unelected goons, so full of themselves, they suffer from God complex. The pocket always hurts most. The part of the body that most hurts is the pocket. Defense industry suspicions emerged. In the past, sequestered funds were released as reparations to rebuild a nation after war. In this case, the EU want to seize the money. During the war, to spend on the EU defense industry, mainly France and Germany, there are serious ethical issues with this. Russian countermoves got predicted. If Russia had won the lawsuit, they would have seized every single corporate and national cent invested in BRICS and their sphere of influence, totaling between $800 billion and $1 trillion. If the EU had won, every single corporation and nation in the world would have withdrawn their funds from Euroclear because they could no longer trust that the EU wouldn't seize them on a political whim, and the EU would have lost exactly the same. December 2025. Events teach a profound lesson about the modern world. Politics controls finance. We like thinking this. Leaders can simply decree the aggressor must pay. We imagine this. The opposite got proven by this crisis. Finance controls politics. Banking system structural integrity, sovereign immunity, legal sanctity, and market collapse. Fear overruled retribution's moral desire. Seizing sovereign reserves presented an abyss. The EU looked into it. The 18 trillion ruble lawsuit was seen. Euro risk was seen. They blinked. Their own citizens would be taxed rather than global capitalism's rules getting broken. They chose this. The system is designed to protect itself. That's why assets remain frozen, war continues, but Euroclear's ledgers remain balanced. The revolution will not be financed by seized assets. Debt will finance it, as always.